paths to truth and meaning, and we support one another as we explore these paths. I would like to especially welcome our guests and welcome again those who have visited us before. Visitors, it is the custom of our congregation to invite you to stand and give your name and where you are from if you feel comfortable doing so. Are there any visitors who would like to share with us this morning? Welcome.
I'm Dana, and I live in Aurora.
Welcome. Welcome. Welcome to everyone visiting today, and please join us after the well. For those of you who are live streaming via YouTube, are we live streaming today? No joys and concerns? No? Okay. There are chairs provided in the back for your convenience. As we begin our service, please silence all electronic devices. Thank you.
We light this chalice for acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations.
Good morning. I'm Kat Gelder, this is Caroline Bailey, and welcome to our service on the language of reverence. We're excited to have all of you here today. The debate in Unitarian Universalist circles over the language of reverence is complex and far-ranging, so wish us luck. But at its heart, it asks us this question: what traditional religious terms, like holy, divine, sacred, are each of us comfortable with using? Which are appropriate, that's a word, appropriate for use in our religion? This is a religion not of creeds, but of shared values, of connection and challenge. And how do we communicate our wonder, our horror, at the most profound experiences that life has to offer us when some words do not have a common meaning amongst us? So this morning, Caroline and I will share our thoughts on the language of reverence, as well as some suggestions to provide a welcoming environment where we can foster our third principle, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual and philosophical growth in our congregations. Now, most likely, every single one of us here today has an opinion in this debate, whether or not we are aware of it. If you have ever attended a church service or service for another religious group, here at this church or another religious group, and you have had a strong visceral reaction, whether positive or negative, to a religious term, then you have some opinions surrounding the use of the language of reverence. So raise your hand if that applies to you. That's what I thought. All right, let's make the sausage then. So as an example, I recently attended a memorial service during which we recited the Lord's Prayer. I chose not to recite it. Since I am an atheist, the words of that prayer do not accurately reflect my beliefs, and I'm not comfortable speaking those truly earnest words when I don't believe them. At the same time, and I know this will sound confusing, so please bear with me, I find solace in listening to and singing the old spiritual Amazing Grace. The language of reverence in this song connects profoundly to my experiences on a metaphorical level. It's the grace of choice that is afforded to every single one of us when we realize that our actions are out of step with our values. Just to complicate matters further, however, I would not support our singing this hymn here at DuPage Unitarian Universalist Church during a normal Sunday service unless we altered the words to be more inclusive of non-Christian philosophies. And I'm guessing that most of you here today have your own opinions on reciting the Lord's Prayer and Amazing Grace, either at home or here at church. So raise your hand if you have your own opinions. There, that's my people. All right. So we all have an opinion on the language of reverence. Hopefully, Caroline's and my thoughts today will help you articulate your thoughts more precisely, which I think is essential. We are a congregation that welcomes people of many spiritual and philosophical backgrounds. We have the lofty and noble and perhaps impossible goal of fostering and challenging all of ourselves as we pursue our spiritual and philosophical development. But the discussion over how to create that environment, what is useful, what is helpful to say, to whom, to when, where, that can quickly spiral out of control. Our opinions on the use of traditional religious language are tied to strong emotions. I would say our strongest emotions: anger, love, comfort, and fear. That is because these words have deep power. These words are worth considering. They are important to talk about. And as we navigate these turbulent waters, it is important to temper our emotions and opinions, positive or negative, with humility and earnest reflection. So please join us on this adventure today. We look forward to hearing your thoughts after the service as this conversation continues. And now, since we would be one in this discussion and this conversation, please join us, rise in body or spirit, in singing hymn number 318, We Would Be One. Teamwork. Yes, keep those hymnals, please. So, what is the language of reverence? Amusingly enough, even this question is a subject of some debate. But here is one introductory description. In 2003, Reverend William Sinkford, then president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, which is our group of Unitarian Universalist churches throughout this country and other countries, I believe, delivered a sermon in Texas in which he recounted a night spent in the hospital as his son struggled to survive after a drug overdose. He experienced a sense of connection that night to something larger than himself, a force that he named God, though he did not ascribe all of the aspects of the traditional Christian divinity to this God. And looking back at Unitarian Universalism after this experience, and particularly the 7 principles, which are printed in the front of that hymnal, the covenant of the Unitarian Universalist Association, he noticed that something was missing for him, the language to describe the power and the meaning of his experience. Words like holy and divine and sacred, for example, were missing for him. He called these words the language of reverence, which was not his phrase. It was a phrase that was coined by a fellow UU minister and humanist, David Bumbaugh. He encouraged other UUs to consider the role that these words might have in our congregations and in our personal spiritual journeys. These are words that have power, he argued. They begin to describe the experience of the human extremes of joy and guilt and gratitude and grief. And we neglect them. And he thought some of us might need them in our lives. So that was his sermon. And it was just one sermon. It was not a national debate until a reporter who had heard the sermon but had little knowledge of Unitarian Universalism published an article about it in a Fort Worth, Texas newspaper. He condensed the nuanced institutional and philosophical discussion down to the inaccurate first sentence: a former atheist who is now president of the Unitarian Universalist Association will push to put the word God in a new statement of principles. Oh, boom. So you can imagine that this sparked no end of reactions, ranging from excited support to dismayed rebuttal. Sinkford and the reporter clarified their statements later, but the firestorm had already developed a life of its own. And it seemed that everyone had an opinion on the subject, and so if nothing else, it must have been an important subject. Here are some of the salient responses. Reverend Kendall Gibbons, a former minister of our church and a well-respected member of the humanist community who embraces the language of reverence, wrote a response to the debate. The language of reverence, she argued, was unavoidable if humans hoped to fully describe the extent of human experience, and its use did not require belief in a god or gods.
She wrote, "The language of reverence is finally the language of humanity. The human experience of finding ourselves in the presence of that intense, fleeting, and demanding moment when the dull surfaces of things become transparent to a significance almost greater than we can bear, belongs to all of us. Only by not paying attention can we avoid it. It doesn't need gods or angels or magical other worlds. The world we have is magical enough, holy enough, sacred enough. We are the ones who bring the eyes to see, the minds and souls to marvel. We are the ones who must build the meanings of our brief days out of what we find to be deeply and powerfully important, right here, out of the utterly natural stuff of life. The holy is nothing but the ordinary, held up to the light and profoundly seen. It is the awareness of a creativity and a connection that we do not control in a universe that is always larger, more intricate, and more astonishing than we imagine. It is the acknowledgement that we are formed by the earth, from which we arise and in which we live and move and have our being. And that we are finally not alone. For our very humanity is illuminated for us by our fellow beings, each of whom offers the authentic presence of the divine.
Reverend David Bumbaugh, who originally coined the term language of reverence, affirmed that we do need a language of reverence to engage in the world as a religious group. And to this degree, he agreed with Reverend Sinkford. Our truths, he said, this is not a quote, I'm paraphrasing, our truths, in particular, the profound truth that scientific findings illuminate that we are fundamentally interconnected with every aspect of our universe, are too important to neglect this task of interfacing with other religions and of spreading our word. However, he argued that traditional religious language was not a sufficient tool. This language, he argued, is now too far intertwined with commercial and political messaging to be an effective vehicle for critiquing society. In a 2000,
Okay. Yeah. This is David Bumbaugh. In a 2003 sermon, he responded thus to Bill Sinkford. Our religious story needs to be in conversation with other religious traditions, but that conversation cannot take place if we allow our vision to be poured into the old wineskins of infinite categories. The language used to sell cars and toothpaste and morally bankrupt political and economic agendas. The language manipulated to generate a sense of warm comfort in a world growing steadily more dangerous. That language that disguises human extremes of joy, guilt, gratitude, and grief. Oh, I'm sorry. That language that disguises and eviscerates the radical alternative it offers. We must offer a powerful religious vision conveyed in a language of reverence appropriate to the faith it represents in the marketplace of ideas. If we are able to do that, perhaps we can provoke a real conversation.
Sheila Schuh, Director of Religious Education at the May Memorial UU Society in Syracuse, New York, had yet a different angle of argument.
The problem is not a lexical one that we need a language of reverence, more religious language. The problem for me is that we lack a reverence for the language we already have. What a trap. A typical UU one, nevertheless, to think that if we only had more verbiage, more spiritually sophisticated words, if only we had better words, then we would better know who we are, what we believe, and be able to express it more fully to the other faiths. I don't think we need any more words right now. We need an experience of our words. We need more living of our words that we might better hold their meanings in common.
So as you can see, the debate over the language of reverence and its appropriate use ranges far and wide. It encompasses the following questions, and some others I'm sure, but I submit these for your reflection this morning. What words are meaningful to me? What words are meaningful to UUs in general? What words are meaningful to human beings in general? Is traditional religious language the only language of reverence that is worth using? And if not, is it worth the work to craft or deepen a new language of reverence? To embrace the words that we already have more fully? Or learn to see them in a new light? If you used more traditional religious language, would it be helpful in interfaith work? Or would it create a false impression of a religion that embraces people with diverse perspectives? And how should individual congregations like our own handle the use of traditional religious language? It is an incredibly difficult set of questions to answer. We will not answer them this morning. We will not answer them this year. They may be impossible to fully answer. It is an arduous task, but it's time to roll up our sleeves.
So, as I recall, the genesis of today's topic came out of some give and take at the Sunday Services Committee, of which Kat and I are both members. And after that, a realization that over a couple words, we really did see things differently. I thought of the old joke that a Unitarian Universalist comes to a fork in the road. One sign points to heaven. The other sign points to a discussion about heaven. So we plunged into the discussion. I am often reminded that people come to Unitarian Universalist religious tradition from many places and in many ways. They may be wounded by a previous religious affiliation, or they may be outgrowing and shedding it like a too small coat, and they are ready for a new one. Some are seeking spiritual nourishment or a community having previously had none. And some are wanting to blend the best of two traditions in one family. And some, like Kendall Gibbons and myself, are brought to Unitarian Universalism when we were young by our parents. We grew up in a UU religious education program. We were taught to build our own theology, to develop our own religious language. We were also taught that our religious education was lifelong and that our ideas would change and grow as we changed and grew. So in addition to our own personal lifelong task of building our own theology and our own theological words, the language, the language of reverence, both in our own musings about the big questions of life, in our reactions to what some would call traditional religious language, there is also the larger question of how we should use these words in our congregational life together, including on Sunday morning. How we should build our own theology together as a congregation. One example, I was just going to say, on Sunday morning, we worship together. I like that word. It speaks to me about why I come to church. However, in talking to people, I realized that, to me, the word worship is a human action. It expresses a human need. It is an intransitive verb, to worship, rather than, as many people have construed it, a transitive verb, which in traditional language always has an object of worship, a god, Vishnu, etc. Kendall Gibbons also writes at one point, rejecting religious language because we cannot believe it, literally, is just as constraining as believing we must do exactly as it says. Or believing that there is only one meaning of a particular word, and that is the one that I know or that I use. Here's another example. Even before we finished our remarks, I chose the words for the offering and the closing from our gray hymnal because I like them and they seem to relate to the topic. When I looked again, both of them used the word spirit and spiritual. In the offering, to let the spiritual, unbidden and unconscious, grow up through the common. And the closing line of the closing words by Hosea Ballou, let us endeavor to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bonds of peace. The word spirit and spiritual does not raise red flags for me, and it's not one that I avoid. But it is one that we need to take a look at as a congregation, because just in those conversations, I'm aware that there are a multitude of experiences with those words. However, I do think that in our worship life together, there can be inclusive and exclusive uses of these religious words. Spirit and spiritual express a deep yearning or an important experience in a way that draws us in, draws us together, encourages us to think and feel, rather than asking us to take a side or to take a stand. Inclusive use of religious language is not from the top down, but it allows growth up from the bottom of our common experience. The language of reverence, in my mind, will always be imperfect, since the definitions and connotations of words change with the time and the context. To paraphrase Paul Tillich, who we had just a few weeks ago, I see that the words may be pointing towards our experience, an experience which is unable to be captured by the language. The words themselves are symbols or directional signals. Our liberal religious tradition gives us the freedom to continually experiment, to see what words express the essence of our growing experience. Of course, knowing that language can never capture it completely. But we also have a responsibility to come together as a community and there to search for our common language. This does not, to me, mean simply a watered-down, least common denominator of words. It does mean taking seriously the fact that each of us has had different experience. And we are coming together seeking different things. The responsibility is to strive for language that is inclusive rather than exclusive, opening up thought and feeling rather than attempting to channel it narrowly. It means to me offering words with an open hand, not a closed fist, with a light touch, but not an unthinking tossing it out. It may mean using several words together, allowing several doors into the experience. I think we do this when we name a time of meditation or prayer together in a service. It sometimes means the words will be tried in a song or wrestled with in silence. For me, it is hard to think of other words to describe what I do most Sunday mornings. I go to church. I worship. This space is a sanctuary, a sacred place. These are words of reverence for me, but it is also a place where I hear differing ideas. I am affected by others' experience, and I place myself to be open to change. Most importantly, it is where I encounter my chosen religious community embodied in all your lovely faces.
Thank you, Caroline. I have found this an extremely difficult service to write for. I'm sure you can't imagine why. But it is mainly because, while I disagree with some uses of traditional religious language during our services here, while generally I try not to include a lot of traditional religious language in the services that I do because it feels inaccurate for me to use words that don't reflect what I'm thinking. I cannot find it in my heart, in my philosophy, in my ethic, to demand blanket censorship of others' words. But where does this leave us, I ask myself? If I cringe inwardly when another person describes Unitarian Universalism as a faith, but I feel no right to make them change their meaning or their wording, then what should I do? Should I just keep cringing? Should I betray my own sense of integrity and tell them that word doesn't apply to our religion? Should I move on? Because the world is full of illegitimate human rights abuses, full of people working hard against powerful forces to promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and there are simply things that are more important than the use of the word faith. none of these suggestions seems to fully answer the problem for me. And I've gained some traction in the debate in my head in thinking of the difference between the words that I speak as a representation of myself, which come from me and can only come from me, and thus must be in sync with what I believe. That's entirely different from listening to someone else speak from their experience, for which I must have respect. I suppose that if someone else believes that Unitarian Universalism is a faith, it is wrong to undermine their experience with my own. But there is a difference, I think, between speaking from our own perspective and the words that we choose to speak together as a group, which is why I think it is extremely beneficial to our religion that our principles do not contain a large amount of traditional religious language, since they are the few words we can agree on. I think we must hold fast to that bedrock of understanding, having finally found some words that most of us can agree on. I think that must remain the same until enough of us change our opinions. But what is left for us to do, I suggest, is something far more difficult than deciding who is allowed to say what and when and why. I suggest that we actually continue to talk to each other and deepen our conversations. And what is far more difficult, I suggest that we actually listen to each other, which is much more different than hearing each other. And it's not that I don't think we're already doing this. I truly believe that everyone in this congregation listens to each other, hears each other, wants to understand each other. I don't think our work is done. This means that if we think the use of the language of reverence is driving people away from Unitarian Universalism, which it may be, and it needs to end full stop, or if we think the language of reverence is great and we should all be using it more often, we are still going to listen. And if we really don't care either way, that's a valid opinion, and we are still going to listen. Here's what I suggest we keep asking ourselves and engage in conversation about. As we find words offensive or inadequate, or as we yearn for words that seem to be missing from our Sunday experience or our spiritual journey. The first question is, what does this word mean generally? Reverend Bumbau joked in his response to Sinkford that the dictionary was the last book that he, Bumbau, was confident all UUs would agree on as a source of authority. So let us turn back to our one good book. He looked up the word reverence, and he found the definition to be a profound feeling of respect, mixed with wonder, fear, and luck. And he said that fit his humanist vision of what fills him with awe and wonder in the natural world. Some words may surprise us, and others won't. For example, the word faith. I looked it up on merriam-webster.com. The first definition for faith is actually not a religious definition. The first definition for faith is loyalty. I thought maybe that's a word that I can consider more. The word sanctuary in Merriam-Webster has as its first definition a sacred space dedicated to the pursuit of a religion. I'm still not sure I'm comfortable with that word. But I feel better having done some homework, having more information to ground my thoughts. The second question is, what does this word mean to me? And I know that seems like a very UU question, but what does it mean to me? But truly, even intellectually, it is valid to have a slightly different definition than everyone else. In linguistics, we talk about the denotation of a word, which is what Merriam-Webster is in charge of coming up with, which is what generally everyone agrees on. It is our common denominator definition. And as much as possible, we remove emotion from those definitions. Connotation is the living, breathing essence of a word. When we talk about a house and a home, they are the same dwelling. But a home is a place of warmth and comfort, unless you grew up in an abusive household. The meaning of that word may be the same in the dictionary, but our experiences can vary widely. Human language is socially constructed and negotiated. The meanings of words, as Caroline mentioned, will change over time, and perhaps the word holy someday will mean wondrous. And it will have very little religious meaning, and we will argue less over it. But we have the words now that we have now. And their meaning will change depending on who we are speaking to and depending on how our experiences affect us in the future in our lives. These words will change. If peaceful to me means not fighting, and to you it means calm and very quiet, we will have a difficult relationship until we realize that we have a different definition of this word. The individual meanings of words matter, and before we can truly engage with someone else about a word and its use in our congregation and our community, we must be aware of what the words mean to us emotionally and where that might come from. The third question is, what does this word mean to the person who is speaking and the person who is listening? And this can be a sticking point, because the meaning of a word is socially constructed. We're free to create our own meaning of the word. And we are also responsible for recognizing, of course, that other people may view it differently. We do not have the luxury to assert, as Humpty Dumpty does in Alice in Wonderland, when I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. And I think that most of us are aware of this, which is an important step in that process. However, let us use this awareness not to be afraid of a word or afraid of offending someone or to invite dissent for the sake of dissent. I love that word and I'm going to use it. I hate that word and we shouldn't use it. Rather, we can use our awareness as a tool that allows us to actually ask other people what they think about the word and then listen carefully. When you say holy, what are you thinking about in connection with that word? Or to explain what we mean, when I say faith, I mean trust in something I can't completely prove. This is an important part of my spiritual journey because I find meaning in the gap between our ambition and our understanding. These kinds of conversations will help us move forward because we will understand more fundamentally important aspects of each other's minds and hearts. Which brings me to the fourth and most important question that I think we can consider and discuss. What is it that fills you with a sense of awe? Awe that inspires in you a sense of love and respect. I think we need to consider this question and revise our answer as necessary, and dare to engage our friends and acquaintances in a discussion of what, in Bumbao's words, he calls what is deepest and dearest. What is the focus of our ultimate commitment? What is the source of human good? What is so precious to us that we cannot betray it without losing our own souls in the process? I invite us all to venture into the territory that Bumbao describes, because I suspect it will force us to confront our disagreements over small things, like words, on the path to discovering our agreement over deep questions, like our hope for meaning in our one precious and transient life. To speak of such powerful forces in our lives demands the precision of well-considered and well-honed language. And to listen to such a tender admission demands respect for the words that clothe it as it ventures into a cold reality. So here is what fills me with awe. Here is what I have reverence for. Deep within our very cells, the elements that sustain us are identical to those that sustain every other human being, our closest friend and our bitterest enemy. The oxygen we breathe was forged in the indescribable heat of ancient stars. As Bumbao writes, the heat of our bodies is the heat of stars tempered to the uses of life. The salt in our blood and in our tears is the salt of ancient oceans. It is encapsulated and carried with us, generation upon generation, into strange and distant places and circumstances. The past is not dead, it lives in us. And I would add, in a universe vaster than we can possibly imagine, we have only each other. Let there be love amongst us. Let us speak our deep truths and listen earnestly to each other. And then I hope, I believe, I have faith that what unites us will be more powerful than what divides us. Thank you.
These are the words of William Henry Channing as we take our offering. To live content with small means, to seek elegance rather than luxury, and refinement rather than fashion, to be worthy, not respectable, and wealthy, not rich, to study hard, think quietly, talk gently, act frankly, to listen to stars and birds, to babes and sages with an open heart, to bear all cheerfully, do all bravely, await occasions, hurry never, to let the spiritual, unbidden and unconscious, grow up through the common. This is to be my symphony. The offering for the support of this church will now be given and received. Please rise as you are able and join me in our hymn number 354 in the gray hymnal. I think we're going to need the hymnals again, so. Okay. from Hosea Ballou. If we agree in love, there is no disagreement that can do us any injury. But if we do not, no other agreement can do us any good. Let us endeavor to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bonds of peace. Now please rise and greet your neighbors and go out and hopefully have a good day today.